Mr. Majewski's Anatomy 32 class lecture, Chapter 18, Part 1, Meninges and Brainstem. So, as we talked about in the previous chapter, the spinal cord and brain are surrounded by three layers of connective tissue. And now that we're in the brain, they're referred to as the cranial meninges. The three layers are, from superficial to deep, the dura mater, which is most superficial. It's actually broken down into two layers here in the cranium, the periosteal layer that is next to the bone, the skull, and the meningeal layer, which is going to be the one that is followed by the arachnoid mater. And then there's the subdural space between the meningeal layer and the arachnoid mater. And then you have the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, which lies directly on the brain. Now, it turns out that in the cranial area, the meninges actually extend deeper into the cavity, basically going into the separations of the different parts of the brain. So, for instance, between the left and right hemisphere of the cerebrum, you have the falx cerebri. Between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, you have the tentorium cerebelli. And then between the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, you have the falx cerebelli. So, a little confusing, but you have the falx cerebri for between the two lobes of the cerebrum, and the falx cerebelli between the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. Now, the meninges can intentionally be inflamed, and this is referred to as meningitis. And meningitis can be due to many things, but most commonly caused by an infection. And these symptoms can include fever, headache, stiff neck, vomiting, confusion, lethargy, and drowsiness. And it is possible for meningitis to be fatal. So if you have the opportunity to take vaccines against it, be sure to. Now, running throughout the same area in the subarachnoid space is the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid is clear, colorless, and its main functions are to cushion the brain and spinal cord from impacts and from just normal bouncing around as we move from day to day. So, as I said, mechanical protection, it's a shock-absorbing medium, and it also buoys the brain inside the skull. Chemical protection, it provides the optimal chemical environment for neuronal signaling. So it has the right ion concentrations to help those neural impulses move along. And then circulation. The cerebral spinal fluid does circulate around the brain and spinal cord, so it allows a small amount of exchange of nutrients and wastes. And it also provides a lymphatic type function for the brain and spinal cord. And it turns out that the cerebral spinal fluid is produced by sheets of ependymal cells, which you remember are a type of neuroglia cell found in the central nervous system. And the ependymal cells are mainly found in areas referred to as cord plexuses. So you can sort of see here is this raised, sort of grainy area in the lateral ventricles. And what happens is the ependymal cells will filter the cerebral spinal fluid out of the blood itself. And that means that the ependymal cells cover capillaries, forming a blood cerebral spinal fluid barrier and only allowing to pass through the specific components needed to make the cerebral spinal fluid itself. So, there are four ventricles in the brain. These are spaces that do not contain brain tissue, but instead contain cerebral spinal fluid. In the left and right hemisphere, you have the left and right lateral ventricles. They are a rather large structure, as you can see here, sort of a big giant C, one on each side, and they will then flow into the third ventricle, which is a smaller cavity, sort of in the midline of the brain, superior to the hypothalamus. And then finally, there's the fourth ventricle, which is found between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Now, these are all connected together because the cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow around the brain and spinal cord. So, the lateral ventricles flow into the third ventricle through the interventricular foramina. Then the third ventricle flows into the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct of the midbrain, also known as the cerebral aqueduct. And then finally, from the fourth ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid can escape through the median aperture and lateral aperture to enter the subarachnoid space and go around the brain, or it can enter the central canal of the spinal cord and then flow down and around the spinal cord itself. Finally, when all is said is done, the cerebral spinal fluid will be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream at the arachnoid villi. So here you can see how the arachnoid villi are protrusions of the arachnoid layer lying adjacent to major sinuses, venous sinuses found in the brain, around the brain. And then they can just absorb the cerebrospinal fluid and send it straight back into the bloodstream. So basically, if you start off with your arterial blood arriving to the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid is filtered out at the cord plexuses in the various ventricles, and then they travel through these ventricles and into the subarachnoid space to then go around the brain and spinal cord until they are finally reabsorbed into the dural venous sinuses in the cranial cavity to then return to the bloodstream. Now, as we all know and have heard, there's this thing called the blood-brain barrier. And this is mainly there to try to prevent infectious agents from getting into the brain because, after all, it is one of our, maybe our most important organ. So the way this occurs is the astrocytes, another type of neuroglial cell found only in the central nervous system, they connect, as you can see in this cartoon here, they connect and contact the capillaries that are running in the brain tissue, that are bringing nutrients into the brain and taking out the waste products. And this joining of the astrocyte with the capillary leads to the formation of tight junctions between the endothelial cells and basement membranes of the capillaries, thereby making it more difficult for things to leave the bloodstream at these capillaries. And this blood-brain barrier is continually maintained by the astrocytes to help protect our brain. So, possible disorders in the brain. You can have hydrocephalus, as seen in this picture here. This is a dramatic increase in the amount of cerebrospinal fluid pressure, usually caused by some sort of blockage in the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid, which means it can't be reabsorbed, and you end up having extra fluid. In the case of infants, this leads to an enlargement of the brain. In adults, it would lead to increased pressure that could lead to brain damage. Another type of disorder is the cerebral vascular accident, or what we would more commonly call a stroke. And this is the most common brain disorder, and it can be caused either by hemorrhaging, aka internal bleeding. A blood vessel pops, basically, leading to less blood going downstream and an increase of pressure where that blood is. Or it can be caused by a blockage in the artery going to the brain, either by an emboli, which is a blood clot, or atherosclerosis of the cerebral arteries. And this will then mean that important nutrients aren't getting to the brain, and the brain starves and dies in that area. So let's talk about the brain in more detail. Well, it turns out there are four principal parts to the brain. You've got the brain stem, which is sort of the neck and body of the seahorse. You have the diencephalon, which is the head of the seahorse. And then you have the cerebellum, this little wriggly thing here, and then the cerebrum, the main part of the brain, which is really what we tend to think of when we think of the brain. So let's focus on the brainstem. The brainstem comes in three parts. You have the medulla oblongata, which is just superior to the spinal cord. You have the pons, and then you have the midbrain. The medulla oblongata controls many vital autonomic body functions, things such as breathing, digestion, rate and force of heartbeat. So it's very, very important just for our basic necessities of being alive. Also, all sensory and motor tracts from the spinal cord go through the medulla oblongata. So basically all the information is coming up and down through the medulla oblongata. If you look at the medulla oblongata, you see a few interesting features to it. it has what are referred to as pyramids, sort of these two columns on the posterior side of the medulla oblongata, and this is where most of the motor tracts coming from below the neck are arriving into the brain. And it turns out that in these pyramids you get what's called the decussation of the pyramids, where 90% of those motor tracts cross over, so that your left side of your brain is getting control of the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain has control of the left side of the body. You also have these lumps on either side, right and left, referred to as the olive. This contains nuclei that are important for controlling impulses from the proprioceptors. These are receptors that are monitoring where your muscles are and how your joints are stretched and so forth, and then sends that information onto the cerebellum. There's also a cardiovascular center inside the medulla oblongata that regulates force and rate of heartbeat, and the medullary rhythmicity area that adjusts the basic rhythms of breathing. And there are 5 cranial nerves that arise from the medulla oblongata. You got the vestibulocochlear nerves, the glossopharyngeal nerves, the vagus nerves, the accessory nerves, and the hypoglossal nerves. The pons, as I say, sort of the belly or body of the seahorse, and it basically is a bridge that helps connect various parts of the brain. For instance, it helps connect the left and right side of the cerebellum, and it also is involved in regulating some of those autonomic functions that we depend on. So some structures in the pons includes the Pontine Nuclei. This is basically where you get a connection of the cortexes of the cerebrum to the opposite hemisphere of the cerebellum in order to help coordinate voluntary motor output so that our movements are properly controlled. Then there's the pneumatic taxic area and the apneuristic area, and these help basically in controlling breathing. And there are 4 cranial nerves that arise here: the trigeminal nerves, the abducens nerves, the facial nerves, and the vestibulocochlear nerves. You'll note that the vestibulocochlear nerve originates at the border between the pons and the medulla oblongata, so it partially originates in each of those parts of the brainstem. And then finally we have the midbrain, or what I like to call is the neck of the seahorse, and it coordinates movements, especially sort of getting into our visual and auditory reflexes. So if someone throws something at your face, you sort of respond before you even think about it. The midbrain is involved in that. And important features of the midbrain include the cerebral peduncles. These are basically motor and sensory tracts that go between the cerebrum and the midbrain, and so that's where the cerebrum and the midbrain actually connect. You got the cerebellar peduncles, which are where the cerebellum connects to the brainstem. Then you have the tectum, which are these 4 bumps here, 2 on each side of the midbrain. You have the superior colliculi, the reflex centers for visual activities such as tracking movement with your eyes, and the inferior colliculi, which relay impulses from the ear to the thalamus. So the tectum is composed of these 4 colliculi. And the 2 cranial nerves that originate here are the oculomotor nerves and the trochlear nerves, which are involved in movements of the eye, so it makes pretty good sense. Finally, throughout the brainstem and into the diencephalon, you see areas of white matter, which are the axon tracts, interspersed with areas of gray matter, which again are neural cell bodies. And you end up with this sort of net-like arrangement that flows throughout the spinal cord, superior portion of the spinal cord, the brainstem, and the inferior part of the diencephalon. And it turns out that the ascending portion is involved in sending sensory axons directly to the cerebrum or through the thalamus. So it's basically a relay sending the information on to the correct parts of the brain. And these functions in consciousness, arousal, and attention. And the descending portion helps regulate muscle tone, something that's important, but not something we actually think that much about, even though it's our voluntary skeletal muscles that are involved in muscle tone. And that's it for this part of the lecture on Chapter 18.